How much did Roman slaves cost, and why? In ancient Rome, you could buy a human being for the same price as a good horse. Or, you could pay 50 times more for a skilled Greek tutor than for a field worker. Welcome to the brutal economics of the Roman slave market, a system so vast and systematic that it literally powered the greatest empire in history. Welcome back to Chapters in History, where we dive into the uncomfortable truths of the past. I am your host, and today we're exploring one of the darkest aspects of Roman society, how humans were priced, bought, and sold like commodities. If you're ready to understand the shocking economic reality behind Roman slavery, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because these numbers reveal a system more complex and disturbing than you might imagine. Today, we're breaking down the brutal mathematics of human bondage in ancient Rome. Chapter 1. The Scale. Rome's massive slave economy. Before we talk prices, you need to understand the sheer scale of Roman slavery. This wasn't a minor part of their economy, it was the foundation of everything. Concise estimates suggest that slaves made up 30 to 40% of the population in Roman Italy at the empire's peak. That's roughly 3 to 4 million enslaved people in Italy alone, with millions more across the provinces. To put this in perspective, the entire population of the United States in 1860, including both free and enslaved people, was about 31 million. Rome had a comparable slave population in a much smaller area, but Roman slavery was different from what most people imagine. These weren't just agricultural workers in chains. Roman slaves included doctors, teachers, accountants, engineers, artists, musicians, and administrators. Some of the most educated and skilled people in the Roman Empire were slaves. This created a complex pricing system, where a Greek philosopher might cost more than a Roman citizen could earn in a lifetime, while a common laborer might sell for the price of a decent meal. Understanding these price differences reveals not just Roman economics, but Roman values, prejudices, and social priorities. The Roman slave market was so sophisticated that it had standardized pricing, quality guarantees, and even return policies. Slaves came with warranties. If your new purchase died within 6 months from a pre-existing condition, you could get your money back. This was human trafficking as big business. Chapter 2. Basic slave prices, the foundation level. Let's start with the basics. What did an ordinary slave cost in Roman times? The answer depends on when and where you're shopping, but we can establish some baseline figures. During the height of the Roman Empire, around 100 AD, a basic unskilled adult slave cost roughly 500 to 600 denarii. To understand what this means, consider that a Roman legionary earned about 300 denarii per year, while a skilled craftsman might make 800,000 denarii annually. So a basic slave represented about 2 years' wages for a soldier, or 6 months' income for a successful artisan. In modern terms, using average American wages, this would be equivalent to about $50,000, $80,000 for a basic adult slave. That's roughly the price of a luxury car or a substantial down payment on a house. But these were the cheapest slaves, usually prisoners of war, condemned criminals, or people born into slavery with no special skills. The Roman market recognized dramatic price differences based on age, health, skills, appearance, and origin. A healthy adult male field worker might cost 500 denarii, while a sickly older slave could sell for as little as 100 to 200 denarii. Children were cheaper initially, but represented investment potential. A young slave who could be trained in valuable skills might cost 300 to 400 denarii up front, but be worth thousands later. Women's prices varied enormously based on age, appearance, and intended use. A young, attractive woman, destined for domestic service or worse, could command premium prices, while older women or those intended purely for labor sold for standard rates. The key insight is that Romans approached slave buying like any other major purchase. They calculated return on investment, operating costs, and long-term value. Chapter 3. Premium slaves. The luxury market. At the high end of the market, slave prices reached astronomical levels that reveal what Romans truly valued, and it wasn't what you might expect. Greek slaves commanded premium prices because Romans considered Greek culture superior to their own. A Greek tutor who could teach rhetoric, philosophy, and literature might sell for 10,000, 50,000 denarii, more than most Romans would earn in their entire lifetime. These weren't just teachers, they were status symbols that proved a Roman family's cultural sophistication. Skilled artisans could also command enormous prices. A master architect, engineer, or sculptor might cost 5,000, 15,000 denarii. Romans understood that certain skills were rare and valuable, regardless of the legal status of the person possessing them. Perhaps most disturbing to modern sensibility, attractive young slaves for sexual purposes could reach the highest prices of all. Beautiful boys or girls, particularly from exotic locations, might sell for 20,000, 100,000 denarii or more. These transactions reveal the intersection of Roman sexual culture, status competition, and economic power in ways that are deeply uncomfortable to contemplate. Medical slaves, trained doctors, surgeons, and healers also commanded high prices, often 820,000 denarii. Romans were practical enough to recognize that good healthcare was worth paying for, even if it came from an enslaved person. The most expensive slaves weren't chosen for their strength or endurance, but for their education, skills, and cultural cachet. This reflects Roman values. They prized Greek learning, artistic talent, and intellectual sophistication above physical labor. Chapter 4: Regional Variations. Where you bought mattered. Slave prices varied dramatically based on geography, revealing the economic dynamics of the Roman world and the sources of their human cargo. The cheapest slaves came from areas of active Roman conquest. When legions defeated an enemy army, the survivors were often sold immediately to traveling slave merchants. These war slaves sold for rock-bottom prices because supply suddenly exceeded demand. A prisoner from a recent German campaign might sell for 200 to 300 denarii simply because thousands were available simultaneously. Egyptian slaves commanded middle-range prices and were particularly valued for their skills in mathematics, engineering, and administration. Egypt had been a center of learning for centuries, and Romans recognized that Egyptian slaves often came with valuable technical knowledge. Greek slaves from the Eastern Mediterranean were the most expensive because they represented the pinnacle of education and culture in Roman eyes. A slave from Athens or Rhodes automatically commanded premium prices based purely on origin, regardless of individual skills. Celtic slaves from Gaul or Britain were prized for their physical strength and warrior skills, making them popular for gladiatorial training or bodyguard duties. They typically sold in the middle price range. African slaves commanded varying prices depending on their specific origin and intended use. Those from Nubia or Ethiopia were often sought after for their perceived exotic appeal, while those from North African cities might be valued for commercial or administrative skills. The key factor was Roman prejudice and cultural assumptions. Certain regions were associated with specific qualities: Greeks with intelligence, Germans with strength, Africans with endurance, and prices reflected these stereotypes regardless of individual reality. Chapter 5: The Business of Human Trafficking. The Roman slave trade was organized as a sophisticated business network that reveals the systematic nature of their human trafficking operations. Major slave dealers operated like modern corporations, with agents throughout the empire buying slaves from local sources and shipping them to major markets in Rome, Alexandria, or other commercial centers. These dealers maintained quality standards, provided financing for large purchases, and even offered trade-in programs for owners wanting to upgrade their slaves. The largest slave markets were incredible spectacles. The market in Rome's Campus Martius could handle thousands of slaves daily during peak periods. Slaves were displayed naked for inspection, with placards listing their skills, health status, and origin. Buyers could examine them like livestock, checking teeth, muscles, and general condition. Slave dealers provided guarantees and warranties that reveal how thoroughly commercialized the system was. If a slave died within 6 months from an undisclosed illness, buyers could receive refunds. If a slave's claimed skills proved fraudulent, dealers would exchange them. Some dealers even offered rental arrangements for short-term labor needs. Financing was available for major purchases. Wealthy Romans could buy expensive slaves on credit, paying in installments over months or years. This credit system made it possible for middle-class Romans to own slaves they couldn't afford outright. The most disturbing aspect was the breeding programs. Romans discovered they could increase profits by breeding slaves rather than just capturing them. Slave women who produced healthy children received better treatment and higher valuations. Children born into slavery were often separated from their mothers at young ages and trained for specific roles. Chapter 6. Factors that determine price. Understanding what made slaves expensive or cheap reveals Roman priorities and the brutal logic of human commodification. Age was crucial. Slaves in their teens and 20s commanded the highest prices because they represented decades of productive labor. Children were cheaper initially, but required investment in training and feeding. Slaves over 40 saw their values decline rapidly unless they possessed special skills. Health determined everything. A strong, healthy slave might cost twice as much as one with visible injuries or chronic conditions. Slave dealers employed doctors to examine merchandise and provide health certificates that buyers could trust. Skills multiplied value exponentially. An illiterate field worker might cost 500 denarii, while the same person with literacy and numeracy skills could cost 1,500 denarii. Specialized knowledge, Greek literature, architectural engineering, medical training, could increase prices by 10 to 20 times. Appearance mattered, especially for domestic slaves who would be seen by guests. Beautiful or exotic-looking slaves commanded premium prices regardless of skills. Romans paid extra for slaves who would enhance their social status through their appearance. Origin created automatic price differences. Greek origin added 50 to 100% to a slave's value, purely based on cultural prejudice. Germanic or Celtic origin might add value for physical labor roles. Egyptian origin suggested administrative skills. Temperament affected pricing. Docile, well-trained slaves cost more than those considered rebellious or difficult. Slave dealers developed techniques for evaluating personality and behavior to predict how easily a slave would adapt to bondage. Chapter 7. The human cost of Roman economics. Behind these cold economic calculations were human tragedies that reveal the true cost of Roman prosperity. Families were routinely separated based purely on economic logic. If parents and children had different market values, they would be sold to different buyers without consideration for emotional bonds. Roman law didn't recognize slave families as legal units, making separation both legal and common. The breeding system created horrific incentives. Slave women were valued partially based on their reproductive potential. Those who produced children quickly and regularly were considered more valuable investments. Children knew from birth that they were property to be bought, sold, or traded at their owner's convenience. Training for high-value roles often began in childhood and involved systematic brutalization. Boys destined to become gladiators were trained from age 8 to 10 in combat techniques. Girls intended for domestic service learned submission and obedience through harsh discipline. The psychological impact was deliberately cultivated. Romans understood that successful slavery required breaking people's spirits and replacing natural human dignity with learned helplessness. This process was factored into pricing. Recently captured slaves cost less because they required breaking in before becoming fully productive. Even successful slaves lived with constant uncertainty. A Greek tutor earning respect and decent treatment could be sold immediately if his owner needed cash. Skilled slaves who became emotionally attached to Roman families could be separated from them without warning, based purely on economic decisions. The entire system was designed to maximize profit while minimizing recognition of enslaved people's humanity. Romans created elaborate legal and cultural frameworks to justify treating humans as property, while simultaneously depending on their intelligence, skills, and labor. Chapter 8. Why Rome depended on slavery. Understanding slave prices reveals why Rome became so dependent on enslaved labor that they couldn't imagine their society without it. The economics were compelling for individual Romans. A middle-class family could buy a domestic slave for 600 denarii and receive decades of unpaid labor worth thousands of denarii in wages. The return on investment was extraordinary. especially for skilled slaves who could earn money for their owners through their talents. For the Roman economy as a whole, slavery solved crucial labor problems. Massive construction projects like aqueducts, roads, and amphitheaters required thousands of workers who could be bought once and used for years. Free wage labor would have been enormously expensive for such projects. Slavery also enabled Roman military expansion. Conquered enemies became slaves who funded further conquests through their sale and labor. This created a self-reinforcing cycle where military success generated the wealth needed for larger armies and more expansion. The intellectual labor provided by educated slaves was equally important. Romans recognized that they needed Greek learning and technical skills to govern their empire effectively. Rather than developing their own educational systems, they simply purchased pre-educated Greeks as slaves. But this dependence created fatal weaknesses. When military expansion slowed and the supply of new slaves decreased, the Roman economy struggled. The system that had powered Rome's rise eventually contributed to its decline by making Romans dependent on a labor source they couldn't control indefinitely. Final chapter. And that's the brutal mathematics of Roman slavery. A system so economically rational and morally horrific that it powered an empire while destroying millions of lives. Understanding these prices reveals not just Roman economics, but Roman values and the true cost of their civilization. The slave markets of ancient Rome remind us that even the most sophisticated societies can build their prosperity on fundamental injustice. What do you think? Does understanding the economic logic of Roman slavery help explain how such systems persist, or does it make them even more disturbing? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to explore more uncomfortable truths about ancient civilizations, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Next week, we'll dive into another aspect of Roman society that reveals the complex relationship between progress and exploitation. Thanks for watching, and remember, understanding the past, however uncomfortable, is essential for building a better future.